Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to edition 53 of the Food Safety Fridays webinar program. My name's Simon Timpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. It's great to be with you here again this week. This week, we have Jessie Leal, Quality Manager from AIB International, and Jessie's going to be presenting on preventive controls and HACCP. For those of you who need to comply with the Food Safety Modernisation Act and get your HACCP plans up to HARPC speed, you really do need to log on to this webinar today to find out more about it. I'll leave it to Jessie to obviously deliver the presentation. I'd like to thank at this point the sponsors: Trace Analytics, Safe Food 360, FSSC 22000 and Metal of Toledo. These kind sponsors help to bring these webinars to you free of charge each week and allow you to get some free education and a free certificate of attendance. So all good, everyone's a winner. And we also have to thank our kind presenters. And without further ado, hello Jessie, how are you doing?
Good morning, I'm doing very well. Thank you very much, Simon.
It's great to have you with us. And where are you calling from today, Jessie?
Well, I'm calling from Arizona. So it's about 100, will be about 111 degrees here today. So
fantastic. And would you like to know how many attendees we've got registered for today?
Yes, off to the right, I was looking and seeing all of the different people from around the world. So yeah, very, very interesting to see.
Yeah.
We've got people from everywhere.
Yeah, and we've got actually today's webinar, I don't want to frighten you, but we've got 1,587 registered, which is a record. So you've not done the presentation yet, and you've already beaten a record, which is fantastic.
Wow. Well, I feel honored.
Okay, Jessie. Well, I'm just going to talk to the audience about next week's webinar. While I'm doing that, if you can get your PowerPoint ready, I'll be back to you shortly. Okie dokie. In the sidebar, ladies and gents, you should be able to see, hopefully soon, it's entitled Food Safety Plans, Doing the Hazard Analysis Right. And that's with Oscar Rodriguez Gonzalez. Oscar's presented a few times before, and it actually does fit quite nicely with this week's presentation because next week Oscar's going to be giving us some tools and techniques for actually conducting a hazard analysis and how to classify hazards. So that'll be more in detail from today. So hopefully you can join us next week. I'll be back for the Q&A shortly. Just to say, today's webinar is being recorded. As we do every week, everybody that registers will get an email shortly afterwards with the video recording and the slides and the certificate. So if you do miss a bit today or have to get called away, don't worry about it. We'll follow up afterwards. But for now, I'll hand you over to Jessie and I'll be back for the Q&A later. Okay, Jessie.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. I was looking at the list. There's quite a long list of people from around the world. So this is going to be interesting. What I'm going to be talking about here on the preventative controls and HACCP is something that is a very hot topic right now in the food industry. I'm sure some of you are signed in to see exactly what you need to do to comply. And there's other ones that are going to be signing in to see from an exportation standpoint, either import or export. And I'm going to be hitting on some of those items as we go through. So the learning objective in this presentation is to find out, why do we have to have FSMA? Why was it even developed? Where are we at in the food industry? What is the intent? What are they talking about as far as preventative controls? That a lot of companies, the majority of the companies, will have to comply with in several months. As we all know, these proposed rules were passed to final rules. Companies that have to comply within a year's time have several months to put these programs into place. But we're going to be talking about, one of the slides I have is very interesting and shows exactly why the regulators had more than enough ammunition to be able to show the food industry that some improvements had to be made. There were a lot of concerns going on in the food industry, and these concerns were both products that were produced here in the United States, as well as products and ingredients that may have been imported in from other parts of the world. So some of the information we'll be looking at is, you know, the information that they got, the numbers from were from recalls. And we're talking about class 1 recalls. So the class 1 recalls are obviously, you know, a type of situation where someone's life could be in danger as far as from a health standpoint. So they looked at the class 1 recalls by the numbers to see what's going on out there in the food industry. Where do we have our biggest opportunities? Okay. We're also going to look at the intent of FSMA and HARPC. Ironically, I was in Latin America yesterday conducting an evaluation with a large customer. One of the things that we did see going through this test was there's a comfort level that unfortunately we feel that the industry has with HACCP. There's a lot of plants that feel if they have a formalized HACCP program that they should be good to go, and they could pretty much just slide that over and say, okay, we have HACCP, we'll change the title, we'll change the name to HARPC, we've got our critical control points, and we should be a good place or good to go. And nothing could be further from the truth. I think there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of information that will help if you have a formalized HACCP program, but they are drastically different as far as these programs. We're also going to talk a little bit about some exemptions, and they're really not exemptions. What they're talking about there is there's a lot of food products or the certain industries that are exempt, okay? And they're exempt because they're already being covered under other programs, or they're being regulated under other programs. An example would be HACCP and seafood and juice. So there's an exemption there, and it's not that they don't have to comply with HARPC, it's that they're already covered under the HACCP requirement. And there's other ones as far as dairy with the PMO and other exemptions such as that. So when you see the exemptions, it's not that they don't have to comply, it's that they're already compliant with maybe a more stringent program. So we'll also look at just kind of the review of HARPC, which stands for Hazard Analysis Risk-Based Preventative Controls. And one of the most important words in that acronym is prevention or preventative. This is what the regulator said the industry must focus on now is not reactive, but we need to be more preventative. We're a very reactionary society, you know, across the world. I've been fortunate to travel to numerous countries, and I've seen a lot of similarities in that typically companies and plants and people wait until something happens before they actually put some programs in place. And there's a number of examples I can go through on, but the FDA or the regulator said, this has got to change. We can't wait until these food safety issues occur. We have to prevent them from occurring and control these hazards beforehand. So prevention is extremely important in HARPC. And then we're also going to talk about the next steps going forward, as far as what can we do to prepare our facilities, what can we do to prepare our companies and our relationships with the customers we may have, whether we're importing products and ingredients from other countries or whether trying to export our products possibly into the United States. And I will say that this is a United States program. So if you're exporting products, say, from India to China, then you would need to comply with the regulations that China requires. So this is a US-based program, global, that requires everyone that is dealing with the United States and bringing in you know, food products to comply with those programs. This may be one of the most interesting slides in this presentation, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on this one. This is where the regulators were able to show the industry that we have some work to do, that we have some opportunities. And there's something that's very interesting in this slide. Obviously, if you look here, you can see that over 90% were allergens and microbial concerns. So this pretty much tells you where the focus is going to be. They're a big concern. There's a lot of talk about allergen control and cross-contact. Big focus on microbial concerns such as salmonella and listeria. There's a number of companies currently in the United States going through some issues now with some listeria that was identified in their plant. So this is going to be the big focus going forward. Now, if you look at one of the items on this slide, which is a foreign object, that's very interesting, because if you look back at your HACCP program, just about every facility, including the one that we visited yesterday, typically have foreign material and for the most part, probably metal detection as a critical control point. So what the regulator said is that this HACCP program actually worked, and it worked very well if you followed it religiously. As you can see there, 0.5% of the issues with all of those Class 1 recalls that they looked at was due to foreign material, okay, and typically probably talking about metal. And the reason is, if you have an issue with your products, if they're a suspect product, that product doesn't leave your possession. It should not leave your possession. That product is either put on hold, that product is destroyed, but it doesn't ever make it to the consumers. So what they did is they said, we need to put the same focus that we had on that 1 or that 2 CCPs that we have identified in our facilities. We need to put that same focus on the allergen concerns, on the microbial concerns, on the environmental monitoring programs that we have. The FDA will be coming out with guidance on exactly what is considered low risk and high risk. This will determine who are the plants that are going to have those environmental monitoring programs going forward. And it's not just that, okay, we think we're a high risk, but we have control measures in place. We elect not to have microbial as a preventative control. You also need to provide the rationale behind why you elect not to have an environmental program, or why you decide that it is not going to be identified as a preventative control. So I wanted to make sure and spend a few minutes on this, because this is pretty much the proof that we have a lot of opportunities, and there's a lot of work that we need to do to improve the overall food safety programs and the food safety of products here in the US, and products maybe coming in from other parts of the world. So as I mentioned earlier, they're really focusing on prevention. So as it states here, from correction to prevention. So 402A4, which is the Good Manufacturing Act, was modified from 402A3, where that was pretty much the regulator had to come in and find contamination in your products. So once they come in and found contamination, whatever that may be, a significant, the term they use now is SACOTA, which stands for Serious Adverse Health Consequences or Death to Humans and Animals. When they find a SACOTA situation, which really is a very, very serious food safety concern, or an unsanitary condition, is a more basic term, the FDA typically is when they would react. Now what they're doing is going back to the basics, saying we're going to look at the potential hazards that exist, even though we don't find any direct contamination. If a condition exists in your facility that we feel is a SACOTA situation or an unsanitary condition, we've got now the right to initiate recalls and do some other things based on some regulations that were passed through FSMA, such as suspension of registration and so on. So it's going back to the basics of understanding what the basics are, and what they're talking about here is some of the information we've seen in their audits, where they are identifying basic GMP violations, screening pests out of your plant, basic GMP violations for our employees, touching unsanitary conditions, and then touching our food products or the food contact surfaces that may put those products in jeopardy. Something else that's interesting here is you see the term from farm to fork. I've been in food safety for over 30 years, and I've done, fortunately, I've had a chance to work in agriculture and do some work in the agricultural area. And I can tell you that it really, the food safety programs never really went out completely to the farm. They may have thought they had these programs such as good agricultural practices, but they were really guidance. They weren't law. Well, ironically, with FSMA, there is one item that is Section 105, which is produce standards. So they're even identifying that. So they really are looking from farm to fork now, and they're going to go out all the way to the source, the root cause of the problem, to make sure that we have those items controlled. Supply chain control, or supply chain applied control. This is why probably most of you are signed on today. I noticed there were a number of companies from different parts of the world. And so you're probably looking at, what do I need to do to comply? What's my responsibility to comply with FSMA, HARPC, the supply chain program that they have, the foreign supplier verification program. Excuse me. With that, if there are hazards associated with a said product, the regulators do not care who controls that hazard, as long as the hazard is controlled. There are going to be some decisions that are made, such as if you're bringing products in from one country that there's a known hazard with, that supplier doesn't necessarily need to control that hazard. The importer can actually take responsibility of controlling that hazard if they want to assume that cost to make sure that that is being controlled. That is going to have to be something that's decided between the importer and the exporter and those companies that are doing business globally. And again, as it says there, these are rules and regulations that are going to affect companies at a global market, but they're not going to specifically say who's going to be controlling these hazards. And again, there are literally over 300,000 facilities globally that are imported into the United States. So this is going to affect numerous countries, numerous facilities across the world as far as what they're going to have to do to comply with this. And with some of these, with the rule being passed in September of 2015, we only have a couple of months to go. The way they did the cutoff as far as who would comply in 1 year, 2 years, was the size of the entity or the company. So if you have 500 employees or more, then they figured you're a pretty large company, you have a huge impact on the public, and so we're going to make sure that these companies have to comply first. So that is 2 months away, where we could actually be held responsible or comply with these. And then the smaller companies that were less than 500 employees, as far as a company or an entity, may have up to 2 and 3 years. Okay, so just wanted to throw that in there as far as how much time do we have before we start complying with this. I will say also, there will be a lot of self-regulating. What I mean by that is if you have a large company and they are importing probably from a smaller supplier, they may have to comply within 2 months or on in September 17th of 2016. They are not going to wait until 2017 or even 18 for you smaller suppliers to comply. They will do what's called self-regulating and will require you to have these programs in place at the same time that they do, because you are putting their products in jeopardy. So if you are a small company or entity and you feel you may have a year or two to comply, that may not be the case. Your customers may require you, as far as to comply with the supply chain program, to comply at the same time they do, which will be in less than 60 days or close to 60 days. Okay. And they're also going to talk about the responsibility and accountability that is broken down with FSMA as far as who is responsible for controlling those hazards, those known and foreseeable hazards. And we know what those hazards are. We saw the graph up earlier. We know that there's allergens. Different countries identify different allergens. In the United States, we have what we call the Big 8. In Canada, they have what they call the Big 11, the same 8, as well as several other allergens. And a lot of the other countries pretty much go by what the known allergens are. Latin America, most of the Latin American countries where I've worked extensively identify the same Big 8 allergens that are identified in the United States. So we saw 44% of the issues were allergen related. So you can see that there's going to have to be some very, very strong focus on those programs. And the other big percentage was close to 45% Listeria, E. coli, Salmonella were microbial. So you can see that environmental monitoring is going to also be a very, very large program that we're going to have to look at. And this is even going into the private sector as far as what responsibilities and accountabilities do we have to protect the consumers from a food safety standpoint. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to spend too much time here. I talked about the exemptions. So one of the examples would be seafood and juice. And the reason is they're covered under the HACCP program. They're HACCP regulated. You also have dietary supplements and other examples such as thermally processed low acid canned food. And so those are the exemptions we mentioned earlier. And it's because they're already covered under very, very strict programs. So here's where you can find a lot of the information. When we teach this course, we break it down to the different subparts. and they've really done a very good job of explaining what is expected and what they mean by a qualified individual, which we will explain a little later on in this presentation. But this is where you will find those sections in Part 117 of the Good Manufacturing Practices as far as HARPC. Subpart A, they talk about the general provisions. Subpart B, the good manufacturing practices as we know them. If we are familiar with good manufacturing practices, the GMPs, there aren't going to be any new GMPs. They changed the the section of where you locate those. It's almost like they put the old Section 110 on the shelf for a later date, but they're still going to be very, very important in the food industry as far as making sure and controlling hazards that exist every day in the different facilities. Subpart C was where they break down the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls, the modified requirements. So you'll find in Subpart D and in E, you'll find the qualified facility exemption, requirements under Subpart F applying to records. Very, very important. They're really focusing on documentation and records, even the legibility. Yesterday, we tested this and found examples, going through this mock HARPC evaluation, and we found some issues with documentation. Those are the type of things now that are going to cause problems for us, in that we got very comfortable with being able to catch up documentation and not having real-time documentation with conditions that exist in the plant. And this is one of the comfort levels that we need to get out of, is we really need to make sure that our records are maintained, that they're real-time records, that they're accurate, and show the conditions in the plant. So the old days of catching up on records and at the end of the week is not going to be acceptable. They're going to challenge these facilities to make sure that these records are up to date. They will have the opportunity to look at records in plain sight. So as regulators are going through the facility, looking at the records that are typically maintained, for the operators, they will be looking at those. And when you have a Dakota situation, then it changes as far as that would be what they call situational access. Then they can actually look at any records associated with that suspect product. And in the Subpart G, you will look at the supply chain program and the information associated there. So some of the new key definitions. What is a qualified individual? And we're going to break that down as far as what is the explanation from the regulatory folks, or the FDA, is who is qualified to oversee the HARPC program, to implement these programs. They also talk about the hazards, or the known or reasonable foreseeable hazard. And I talked about that. And we know what these hazards are in the food industry. You can look at another acronym here in the US, the RFR, which stands for Reportable Food Registry, and look at all of the issues that have occurred, and take a look at why products have been recalled. A lot of those are going to be from that graph that we saw earlier. Numerous allergen concerns and numerous microbial concerns, salmonella, listeria. So we know what these known hazards are. Now with HARPC is, how do we control these hazards? Who's controlling those hazards? And the documentation associated with that, and the proof that these hazards are being controlled. And there's going to be some other specific documentation on how long you have to retain that information as far as the records, which is 2 years under HARPC. So this is where they're going to say, okay, well, now we know what those known or foreseeable hazards are. We need to put a preventative control measure in place to control those hazards. They also break it down as far as preventive control, RTE, which stands for Ready to Eat Food, and the Supply Chain Control Program. So as far as the qualified individual, the FDA currently recognizes one institution that you have to obtain this training from, but they're also looking at the qualified individual as someone that has the education, training, or experience, or a combination thereof, necessary to manufacture, process, pack, hold, clean, and produce a food safe product as appropriate to the individual's assigned duties. There's going to be a number of qualified individuals you will have that FSPCQI, which is that individual that would be, I guess if you use an example, would be kind of like that HACCP coordinator in your HACCP program. That person that is responsible and in charge of making sure that the preventative controls are properly identified, that the hazards have been properly identified, that the documentation associated with that meets the requirements, that the information is up to date, that the information has been signed off and validated. We'll hear a lot of words like validation, verification, corrective action, very, very similar words that we've heard for many years with the HACCP program. So unfortunately, when people see that, they just automatically assume it is pretty much maybe like a HACCP program on steroids, or just an expansion of the HACCP program. And there are some similarities, but there are some distinct differences as well. Okay, and who are some of those people that are going to have this training? Well, they're going to be line employees. Ironically, the exercise I did yesterday, I interviewed some of the employees and was very impressed with their knowledge and the training that it was obvious that they had received. And a lot of times where I see some of those issues are with some of the supervisors that may not be as knowledgeable of the specific information that has to be controlled. Okay. But this is where, or these are some of the people that are going to have this training as far as to understand the hazards that are associated with the job that they do. As an example, if it's on temperature control, if it's on temperature control with say ovens or fryers, if it's on allergen control, whether that be with receiving, whether that be on labeling, whether that be on proper storage, they're going to have to understand what the risks are, why they're doing what they're doing, the documentation associated with that. So going forward, the training program that we have to support HARPC is going to be also extremely important. So what that preventive control qualified individual means is a qualified individual, and I mentioned this earlier, is that has completed the training and the development and application of the risk-based preventive controls, or at least equivalent to that received under the standard curriculum recognized by the FDA. Okay, this person, as I mentioned, will be responsible for developing, implementing, and managing that food safety plan. So if you think about an example, it would pretty much be kind of like that HACCP coordinator that we have, that food safety manager that you have in a plant that oversees the food safety programs. What this means, a person is qualified, is a qualified individual as defined in this part, and has the technical expertise obtained through education, training, experience, or a combination thereof. So there might be some more training that we have to send those individuals that we elect to be that person to comply with this. There might be some plants that do not have that person currently in-house. One of the many questions that we've had in some of the FSMA seminars that we've conducted is, can that person be at corporate? If we have 37 plants, can that one qualified individual be at the corporate level? Well, it can be, but there are also some specific information within FSMA that says that qualified individual has to oversee the programs, oversee the documentation. So that's going to be extremely difficult when you have an individual that sits at corporate and you have 35 plants across the country, of how they can manage that. How are they going to be able to evaluate the programs, the documentation? And so this is going to be something that every plant will have to have a qualified individual on site to be able to effectively manage this program. Again, it says, an employee, it could be a government employee, an audit agent, or certifying body. They give some examples there that, it can be subcontracted out. However the company decides to identify that person that's going to be overseeing that program. Again, it comes back to the regulators do not care who's controlling the hazard and how you control that hazard, as long as it is controlled. So what is a hazard? What are they talking about on these hazards? Well, there are a couple of items that they added, and when we see the list of hazards that we need to evaluate, it's quite a bit longer than the old traditional biological, chemical, and physical that we're used to in HACCP. Okay, obviously these three are also listed, but they talk about radiological. We have to conduct, know that there's no potential radiological concerns. And I can tell you where this came from was at the time that they were looking at HARPC and FSMA, when this was passed in 2011, was close to the time that we had the event that over in Japan with the nuclear power plant. And so that is why they were concerned of this potential hazard that could happen in certain parts of the world, and why it was included. Okay, so here's the list. So as you can see there, you got biological, chemical, and physical that we're all used to under HACCP. But these are the other things that we have to at least consider as well. Radiological, natural toxins, pesticides, drug residues. Ironically, most of these are going to be evaluated in your chemical hazard program. The one at the very end there, EMA, which stands for economically motivated adulteration, is one that also we need to consider and conduct a hazard analysis for. And again, an example I can give on that is replacing a less expensive ingredient with, or replacing a more expensive ingredient with a less expensive ingredient, which is obviously misleading the consumer. So, and this has happened on occasion where companies maybe use an ingredient for the process of their product. And so they included also economically motivated adulteration. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to cause an illness or an injury, but something that we also have to consider. And obviously you can see allergens, human food only. What that means is if you look at the human food rule and the pet food rule, the only difference, or one of the biggest differences, is everything is almost identical with the exception of allergens. That is the one thing you will not see in the pet food rule compared to the human food rule as far as under FSMA. So what do those reasonable foreseeable hazards mean? Well, any biological, chemical, including radiological or physical hazard that is known to be or has the potential to be associated with the facility or the food. So some plants have said, well, we've never had a class 1 recall here. We've never had an issue. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have had to have an issue in your facility. If your industry has had issues, then unfortunately, you have to consider those hazards to be possible in your facility as well. You look here, the one that most facilities have control of, or they're scared to, very, very scared to have a problem within their facility, is physical contamination, glass, metal. And ironically, this is why most plants have as part of their prerequisite programs, which is a term we used in HACCP. We have glass and brittle plastic. We have metal contamination or metal detection, X-ray. They have put those programs in place. And if you remember the fourth slide that we looked at, we've got good, very, very good control of those programs or those hazards. Now what we need to do is extend that out to the other known hazards, okay? So the hazard evaluation includes an assessment of the severity of the illness or injury. So you have to look at the health hazard as well, to the hazard that were to occur and the probability that this hazard will occur in the absence of preventative control. So in talking to some of my colleagues in the trainings that they've received, one of the best explanations of the preventative controls, or where should we apply a preventive control, would be ask yourself this question. If you have a preventative control, and if you were to remove that preventative control, or in the absence of that preventative control, if the product were to go out and that product could cause illness or injury or death, then that is going to be probably where you would have to have a preventive control in place. So it kind of explains that here, looking at the severity and probability that the hazard will occur in the absence of preventive control. So ask yourself, in the absence of that metal detector, in the absence of that sifter, in the absence of that environmental monitoring program, in the absence of that allergen program, the labeling, for instance, could this product get out and cause harm? Absolutely. So that's where we need to take a look at and implement those preventative controls and everything associated with that as far as documentation, training, etc. So the hazard requirement preventive control means a known or foreseeable hazard for which a person knowledgeable about the safe manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding of food, based on the outcome of the hazard analysis, establishes one or more preventive controls. So it may not just be one preventative control. There may be several preventive controls to control that hazard. To significantly minimize, okay, and this is some terminology that we've seen in programs such as HACCP, minimize to a safe level or prevent that hazard in a food and components to manage those controls, such as monitoring, corrections or corrective actions, verification, as well as records, as appropriate to that food, the facility, and the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system. So these are where we're going to have to look at, where do we have these preventive controls? One thing I will say is you will not see the term CCP, which stands for critical control point, in HARPC. They were very, very adamant about not having critical control points in HACCP. And the reason is when you have a critical control point, you tend to focus only on that critical control point, or you put more focus on that. What they wanted the industry to do is you will have more preventative controls. We want you to focus on the preventive controls the way you would a critical control point. Because if we did that, then that 44% as far as the allergens and the other percentages that were pretty high, we can get those down to that 0.5%, such as foreign material. So you will not see critical control points. Those are somewhat being replaced with preventative controls. So what does a preventive control mean? Well, those risk-based, reasonable, appropriate procedures, practices, and processes that a person knowledgeable about the safe manufacture of that product, whether it's processing, packaging, or holding of the food. So if you look at that, well, do you process or produce? Do you pack a food product? And are you a holder of food, such as a distribution center or a depot? There are some exemptions there, depending on if the food is fully packaged and shelf stable. That's another item they talk about under the sanitary transport rule, whether you're exempt from requiring complying with that or not. Then they would have to employ to significantly minimize or prevent that hazard under the hazard analysis, okay? And this is going to be consistent with the current scientific understanding. So we can't just go by what our supplier states. We have to provide the information, the scientific information of where we obtain that information from, okay, for the packaging, processing, and packing of that food product. Ready to eat, don't really need to spend a lot of time on this. I think we understand what ready to eat means. When you have ready to eat food products, there's some other things that the regulators said we need to do. Any food that is normally eaten in its raw state or another food, including a processed food, which is reasonably foreseeable that the food will be eaten without further processing, we need to make sure that there's no hazards associated that could affect these food products after the preventive control measure, such as after the fryer, after the oven. Is that product exposed to the environment? If that product is exposed to the environment, are there conditions in that facility that would put that product at risk? As some basic examples I can give you. So we have products that come out of after a preventative control, such as the temperature in an oven or a fryer. And then you have conditions such as leaks, condensation, foreign material conditions that could affect those products. We need to make sure that we have identified those preventive control measures that's going to protect those products. So the hazard evaluation must include an evaluation of environmental pathogens. Whenever the ready-to-eat products are exposed to the environment prior to packaging, and I will tell you that most of your facilities will have a step or a process where it goes into a cooling process. It must be brought down to a certain temperature before it is packaged. Otherwise, it'll lead to some other issues. So these are the areas that we need to take a look at. What are the conditions in those areas so that we, control those hazards from issues such as pathogens? You could have accumulation if you have allergens or a number of allergens in the facility. Are those accumulations that we have in some of the overheads, do those accumulations contain allergens? Okay, then we get into the cross contact and those concerns. So role of the environmental monitoring product testing. Well, the verification activities to verify consistency and the effectiveness of the preventive controls. Environmental monitoring as appropriate for those ready-to-eat foods. We talk about zone-based. Typically, most facilities will test in zones 2, 3, and 4, which is going to be the areas adjacent to, obviously, zone 1, which is going to be the food contact surface where the product comes in contact with. A number of plants do not test in zone 1 because the way the regulators state, if you find a microbial or an environmental concern in zone 2, there's a good chance that that condition is going to affect those products, or those products may be affected. This is done as appropriate for the type of food, the kill steps, the allergen cleaning, the cross contact, as I mentioned earlier, and the big one, which is going to be supplier verification. We need to make sure and have those written procedures, corrective actions, and record keeping associated with that. And they need to be real time, and they need to be accurate and legible. What supply chain control means: a preventative control for a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient when a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient is controlled before its receipt. This is going to be where a lot of companies have to do some work with their suppliers and their customers on, okay, we've identified a hazard. Who is controlling that hazard? In some cases, the customer may not be able to control that hazard, so it must be controlled by the supplier. There are other cases where the only way that the hazard can be controlled, such as in a microbial concern, such as possibly E. coli or salmonella in raw flour. Obviously, the mill could control that hazard through heat sterilization, but typically that's going to be controlled by their customer, whether that be a bakery or a facility that is going to be further processing that. So this is going to be very, very big going forward, is who's controlling the hazard that has been identified, and making sure that all of the documentation associated with that to prove that the hazard is being controlled by that supplier from India, by that supplier from Japan or China, from Argentina, from Latin America, before it goes to the United States. So there's some key change, some revisions, 24 food allergen control revisions to the current GMPs. If you look at some of the basics, as I mentioned earlier, changes in personnel, clothing, traffic, and practices, they're going to be looking at these things, how the personnel handle the products, the traffic through areas where there might be potential risks, traffic such as in raw and cooked, allergen areas where allergens are handled, where there's more potential for allergens to cross-contaminate or cross-contact the products. Excuse me. The building structure, separation of processes. Because of cost, most facilities run a lot of the products on the same equipment in the same building. There have been some facilities that have completely separated their processes. When you can do that, you have drastically minimized the potential for these hazards. But again, that is a huge cost, and most facilities will not be able to do that. The cleaning of the product zones, equipment, bulk, and utensils. We currently do that. So you think, well, what's the difference there? Well, now we have to have the scientific information, the testing. You can test now for all of the big 8 allergens and a lot of the allergens that are out there. So what kind of validation do we have? Okay. What about the cleaning of the non-product zones, the equipment and the structures, and examples such as zones 2 and 3? What about the methods of cleaning and the information that you have associated with the CIP cleaning or COP cleaning? The documentation of the charts, the chart recorders, the temperatures on the CIP cleaning system. I have done quite a bit of equipment design training this year with some equipment manufacturers. So you can see that even the equipment manufacturers are seeing that HARPC and FSMA is going to affect them as well. And they have reached out to see what do we need to do to make sure that our equipment is designed properly from a cleanability standpoint. So there's no harborage areas, there's no catch areas. The equipment itself does not lead to contamination of the food products being produced and processed on that equipment. Some of the other changes: allergen controls, procedures to prevent cross-contact. They use the term cross-contact instead of cross-contamination. Again, on play on words, at suppliers, during transport, from receiving to shipping of that foreign supplier. Separation and handling of raw materials, ingredients, premixes, the products in process, rework, and as well as packaging to prevent that cross-contact. So those known or foreseeable, reasonable foreseeable hazards associated with raw materials and ingredients, processes, the environment itself, and the documentation associated with that. So this is where in subpart C of HARPC, you can find the information and what we need to do as far as going forward. Again, unfortunately, in some Part C and D and these different sections, they will not tell you how to control the hazard. They will not tell you who has to control the hazard. They just explain to you when these hazards are identified, they need to be controlled. Okay, so they have explained, and I think it's very easy to go through there and see what applies and what does not apply in our processes, and what changes we have to make going forward. So what must we consider in our hazard evaluation? Well, obviously the formulation of the food, the condition, function, design, and facility and equipment, raw materials and other ingredients, sanitary transportation or sanitary practices, which is covered under Section 111, sanitary transport, the manufacturing and processing procedures, packaging and labeling activities. Unfortunately, there have been many issues with the improper packaging material, or the packaging being the wrong packaging and not declaring the right ingredients. Labeling, proper labeling, as far as to identify the potential hazards or issues such as allergens, identifying the specific allergens that those products contain. Storage and distribution, and the intended or foreseeable use. Some of these we've seen in HACCP. We had the intended or foreseeable use, misuse of the consumer, misuse of the customer, which we have to include there as far as potential hazards if that product is not properly refrigerated after opening, etc. So some of these may include sanitation, including employee hygiene. So what does that mean? Well, they're going to be looking at the employees. They're going to be interviewing employees. Again, one of the things we need to do going forward when we consult and do training is talk to these employees. That's the only way to evaluate. Have they been properly trained? How do they answer the questions? Are they knowledgeable of the preventative controls that they're supposed to be monitoring and overseeing? And any other relevant factors, such as seasonal or weather-related effects, such as toxins, bacteria, that could cause bacteria growth. So undertaking that hazard evaluation, well, we need to assess that severity of the illness and the injury if the hazard were to occur, and the probability. So where do we get some of this information from? Well, you're not exempt if you've never had a Class 1 recall, or if you've never had an issue, a severe type issue in your facility. If your industry had an issue, then unfortunately you fall under that umbrella of the probability that it could occur in your facility. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, in the absence of that preventative control, if that product were to get out to the consumers, could there be an issue? If the answer is yes, that yeah, that could cause a SOCOTA situation, then there's that's where we need to implement those preventative control measures in place. So identifying those preventative controls, who will control the hazard? I mentioned they don't care who controls it as long as it's controlled. What will be the preventative control? Will it be a process control, such as environmental monitoring? Will it be food allergen controls, such as labeling, receiving? What about transportation practices? Could it be a sanitation control to minimize that hazard? What about supply chain controls? And obviously your recall plan, which is really more of a reactionary program that everybody has to have, just in case we have those issues, to be able to identify in a timely manner those products. And there's also other controls such as procedures, practices, and processes or processes, depending on what part of the country you're from. Preventive control management components, monitoring. This is where the plants and the companies really, or the industry, really has to step it up. The monitoring, the verification, the validation, evidence that the planned activity happened real time. We can't use the excuse anymore that we will catch up on the documentation or update that documentation the next day, the end of the shift, the end of the week. This is where the information is going to get lost. So they're really focusing on making sure the activities are happening and documented real time with real time conditions in a plant. Corrective actions and corrective procedures, corrections and procedures must describe the steps to be taken to ensure that the preventive control problem is identified, corrected, reduce that likelihood that the problem will reoccur. All affected food is evaluated for safety, and affected food is prevented from entering commerce. Preventive control management components. And so you look at this, you think, well, very good. We have these all through HACCP, and everybody does if you have a very robust and formalized HACCP program. So some of this we will understand, verification of that preventive control implementation and the effectiveness, environmental and product testing for ready-to-eat foods, the validation, evidence that that preventative control controls that hazard. And then the reanalysis. Most people are not going to wait every 3 years. Typically, plants look at their current HACCP programs almost on a weekly basis. Anytime you have a change in your process, anytime you have a deviation. So it has to be reanalyzed at least every 3 years per the rule. But most facilities are going to be looking at these preventive controls documentation and these hazards on a very, very frequent basis. Okay. So when a PC, preventive control or management element fails, market failure, new information about the hazards, we need to make sure and revisit that program. So subpart D talks about the modified requirements. This applies to the qualified facilities based on the US value of annual sales. So they've got some specific numbers in there, depending on where your sales are, the type of customer. Warehouses solely engaged in the storage of unexposed packaged products. I mentioned that earlier as far as fully packaged shelf-stable products. There are some modified requirements for refrigerated food. But again, you must submit that attestation showing why you don't have to comply and you're not one of those qualified facilities that has to comply with HARPC or FSMA. And obviously, you need to maintain those records. So you have to prove why you are, how you're controlling the hazard. And if there's a known or foreseeable hazard with the products you handle, produce, you have to produce the records and provide proof of why you elected not to identify that as a preventive control and all the documentation associated with that. The withdrawal of the qualified facility exemption. So you could be a qualified facility and lose that if there is an issue or an occurrence. So withdrawal of a qualified facility exemption in the event of an investigation of a foodborne illness outbreak linked to the facility. The results of an inspection make it necessary to protect the public health. So you could be fine, but if you happen to have a situation or an issue where you unfortunately have to go through a Class 1 recall, where products that you have produced could put someone's life in danger, then the exemption that you currently have could be lost. So the requirements as far as records, they do accept original, true copies or electronic records, must contain actual values and observations. They need to be accurate, as I mentioned earlier, indelible and legible. So part of the training going forward, we need to make sure that our employees understand that everyone needs to read this information. Everyone needs to be able to understand the information on these records of that preventative control. It doesn't do us any good if the temperatures that were documented, the times cannot be read. We will not be able to know how much product is suspect. They should be, or they must be created concurrently with the performance of the activity. So the timeliness in our trainings of filling out the records real time needs to be covered as well. And they need to be as detailed as necessary to provide as much information to the regulators to show that the products are being controlled from the hazard standpoint. And the information should be adequate to identify the facility and all the information pertinent to the products being produced in that facility. Other requirements for official review. All records required must be made promptly available to the duly authorized representative. So this really hasn't changed much. When they require or they ask for these records to be reviewed, by law, we have 24 hours to retrieve this information. So if these records are maintained at corporate, again, we talked about record retention, 2 years. Could be kept at corporate, could be kept at the plant level, but we need to make sure and understand what is the time frame that we have to provide this information to those regulators. And again, typically when they start requiring these records is when they're investigating a potential Class 1 type situation or an unsanitary condition or a SACOTA situation, which again stands for serious adverse health consequences or death to humans and or animals. And then the public disclosure, as far as records obtained by the FDA are subject to the disclosure requirements under 21 CFR, which is Code of Federal Regulations, Part 20, the Freedom of Information Act. So in Subpart G, the supply chain program, this information must include using approved suppliers. Approved supplier program has been around for a number of years. Being in the food industry for over 30 years, at one time you would use suppliers based on cost, based on availability, accessibility. Over the years, it changed to make sure that the suppliers were approved to provide food safe materials and ingredients. So most facilities, if not all, have very good approved supplier programs. So some of the information there, appropriate verification activities and frequencies could also include on-site audits. This doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do that on-site audit. It could be from the country if it's recognized by the United States as a recognized country that has comparable food safety programs. Currently, the two countries that are recognized by the United States are New Zealand and Canada, who was recently added. But there's also other ways that we can obtain that information as far as these on-site audits. Could include sampling and testing, review of the supplier's food safety records, as well as others, okay? To look at conducting and documenting verification activities and written procedures for the receiving and handling of those raw materials. So what's next? Every one of the proposed rules have been passed into final rule. A number of them are in place currently. Some, such as HARPC or the preventive controls with the large facilities, will be taking effect in September of 2016. Others, such as sanitary transport, have until April of 2017. So as you can see here, until November of 2016 to come into compliance. We have this transition team as far as looking at our programs, how we're going to go, put this together going forward. We need to obtain, study, and understand the final rule of what we're concerned about, whether that be foreign supplier verification, preventive controls, sanitary transport, obtain, study, and apply applicable guidance, undertake the hazard evaluation. Who's controlling that hazard? I've mentioned that a number of times, and I can't stress that enough. Who is going to control those hazards, those known or foreseeable hazards that we've identified? What will be those preventive controls? Develop those written food safety plans by that qualified individual. Integrate HACCP and HARPC. What are some of our options? And we have not yet told anyone that, yep, you don't need your HACCP program anymore, because there are a lot of scheme type audits, audits that a lot of companies have to comply with, certification audits that still require the HACCP program. A lot of customers still require to have a formalized HACCP program. It is still an excellent tool to identify, control, and minimize hazards in your operation. So how do we integrate HACCP and HARPC? What are our options? And make sure that we engender those qualified individuals in our operations. So we covered what we normally cover in the better part of a day in about 45 minutes to an hour. So we talked about a lot of information. There's a lot of probably unanswered questions out there, a lot of concerns. Hopefully this information is going to cause us to take a step back, go back to our teams, go back to our plants, go back to our suppliers, and see, okay, where do we go from here? What do we do going forward? What communication do we have to have with our suppliers? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Jesse. That was very informative. You did a great job trying to condense that into a short space of time. I have to say, we've actually got, I didn't expect it, but we had 1,600 people registered, and we've got 500 online with us at the moment. And the number of comments and questions has been absolutely unprecedented, really.
Wow.
So much so that you know, they've scrolled down and it's impossible to actually reach some of them. But what I can say also, as well as thanking you, Jesse, I mean, some of the attendees today, obviously very knowledgeable and have been helping and answering questions. Some of the acronyms you used, they've been explaining what they are, linking to sites of information on the FDA and inspection, GC, Canada, and all sorts of things. Great resources and answering questions, especially Narangachai, Maggie. Thanks very much for throughout answering questions, because there is no way we'd be able to address all those questions now. What we can do is we can try to address some of them. There's the qualified individual. Do they need to be certified? And also, can that be a consultant? That was one question.
Yes, these qualified individuals have to show the training that the FDA, that the regulators will require. They have to be able to prove that they have the knowledgeable information to identify the hazards. This could be based on education. This could be based on experience. So there's a number of ways that they're or a combination thereof. There is one course here in the United States given by a university that is currently the only one recognized by the FDA. But they're also looking at other trainings for people that could become that qualified individual that they're going to be looking at as acceptable. So again, Simon, I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions out there of what they are going to accept as incompliant to say that this individual at this said plant meets the requirements for the qualified individual to write, oversee, and implement that food safety plan in the plant and those preventative controls.
Okay. Thank you for that. Also, obviously, a lot of attendees are already certified to a GFSI standard.
Yes.
And can you sort of explain? Obviously, they're all working to the bench, BRC, SQF, FSSC. They're
Yes.
all working to the benchmark of GFSI.
Yes.
What is the transition path for a company that is certified? Have they got to rip it up and start again, or?
No, absolutely not. I will say, and when I was talking about these certification audits, that's exactly what I was referencing to, Simon, was your BRC, your SQF, your FSS 22K, all of those GFSI type of audits. Those are all going to be extremely helpful because those, to comply with one of those certification audits, one of those schemed audits, you have to have met certain criteria. So a lot of the work that has been done with those will assist and will help us to do some of the groundwork for some of the stuff that we will need for those preventative controls. Excuse me, HACCP as well. A lot of the work, you saw a lot of the terminology, verification, validation, corrective action, hazards, identified hazards. So a lot of that terminology is the same. So no, they will not have to kind of start back from scratch. A lot of plants have a lot of programs in place already that is going to help them get to the completion standpoint or a compliant standpoint in a much quicker standpoint if they are accredited and certified in one of these agencies or one of these types of audits.
Okay, thank you. And in reality, when do you think the FDA are going to start or actually visiting plants and auditing?
Well, I can tell you, Simon, that they are already visiting plants. They are already asking for records, even before they actually legally had a right to, receive and obtain those records. Some of the things after 2011, when FSMA was passed into law by President Obama, took effect immediately. The suspension of registration, that is effective. That was effective immediately. Ironically, the ability to collect fees also was put into place immediately. The FDA is currently going into plants and they are doing training and they're asking for some of this information. but we feel that it probably is going to be 2017 before they really actually start going in and start enforcing some of these specific FSMA and preventative control requirements. So even though September 17th is the deadline from the large facilities, it might be, we still might have a little bit of time after that. And then the other thing, unfortunately, is nobody really knows when they come into that plant and that qualified individual is not recognized. They can't provide the proper documentation. They don't have the preventative control identified correctly. They don't have the proper documentation associated for the supplier control program. Nobody really knows exactly what the repercussions are going to be. Will that cause them to suspend that registration? Will there be a letter, a warning letter? So that's going to be something that no one knows until that actually occurs. And then we will know exactly what we need to do going forward as far as for you know, to comply.
Okay, great. And when it comes to the preventive controls, one question they asked, do you need to prioritize those and treat them any differently, or are they getting confused there?
Yeah, what they want the industry to focus on and prioritize, Simon, are the known and foreseeable hazards that are going to be identified as far as preventive controls or controlled through preventive controls. Will they still continue to look at other things in the plants? Absolutely. They will look at the environment in that facility to see if there's any conditions in that environment that could affect those products. And so the environmental monitoring program in those obviously is going to have a big role here. But will they continue to look at other areas? Absolutely. But they really are going to probably be focusing on, for a while, these preventive controls, some of the specifics with HARPC, until they get a good handle on exactly what they need to focus on, where the risks are, where the hot items are, what industries have opportunities. So
yeah, okay, just a question from me really. I mean, obviously there's a lot of work involved, a lot of effort and time gone into developing HARPC, FSMA, etc. Lots of experts. Do you personally think it's better than what we had? You know, in terms of HACCP and prerequisite programs, is it taking us anywhere? Is it going to make us safer? That
would be a resounding yes. And again, I worked in the food industry for 10 years. I've been with AIB for the last 20 years, and I visited plants in over 12 countries. I've evaluated many food safety programs, and the problem is we knew that there were problems, and and I'm saying in general, we knew there are problems that exist. You can look at the RFR in the United States, the number of Class 1 recalls. The FDA is starting to look more, and guess what? They're finding more. So it was just a matter of the more we dug, the more we looked, the more we were going to find. Is this going to be better? I say absolutely, based on what I've seen. And the reason is we are going to go and look a lot closer at the hazards, and we're going to put these preventative controls in place to control those hazards. And we're no longer going to just say, okay, our supplier's controlling that, or we can't control that, so it's out of our hands. Now someone will be forced to control those hazards. So that is a resounding yes, that I believe this is going to make the food safety products safer. Will we still have Class 1 recalls, and will we still have issues and illnesses? Absolutely, because there will still be issues, and it is impossible to control everything that goes out in the food plants. And there will be some plants that will be hard to comply with some of these requirements. It is going to be new. There's going to be cost involved, training. But will it be better? Yes. Will we still continue to have issues? Absolutely. But I think that going forward, we're not going to see it in a short time period. In the future, we will see hopefully a reduction in the number of issues that we're currently seeing in the industry.
Well, that's to be applauded. So a big step forward and a step change. So well worth the effort. So, okay, I think what we'll do is we're 10 minutes over the hour. What I'll do is I'll compile all the questions together, and if any have been left unanswered, I think Melissa has said, and maybe yourself, we can follow up with them, with the attendees later. So. Just like to say, Jesse, from myself, the International Food Safety and Quality Network, and attending today and who may watch this recording in the future. Thanks very much for your efforts today. I know you were working late last night, you not had much sleep, but you've done a tremendous job, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, Simon.
You're welcome. I hope to see you again soon on another webinar. Okay.
Absolutely. Would love to do it. Love to help.
All right. Cheers, Jesse. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Okay. That was great. Hope you enjoyed that and got something out of it. And it's whetted your appetite and perhaps motivated you to get stuck in, because time is running out, and you really need to get ahead of the curve on this one. Lots of information there. We will send the video on the slides, so if you can watch that over and really digest that information. And we'll obviously, if you have questions, you can answer that. We'll answer those. The slides, the certificate's loaded in the sidebar, so you can grab that. It'll probably crash the website, but not to worry, we'll send you the certificate later. Next week, we've got Oscar Rodriguez-Gonzalez, and he's going to be talking about in-depth on hazard analysis, getting deep down into the hazard analysis, and maybe that will help you with this as well. So all I can say is thanks for your attendance today. I've really enjoyed it. Stay safe, have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much. Bye.